Thunderf00t made a bad video where he said wrong things. I want to get this up quickly, so let's just get right into it.
But the parameter space is so complex with these things, you know, because you've got the convolution that humans between when they're born and when they reach adulthood have a 20-year development cycle.
Right, and this is why you have different heritability estimates by age, and why most of the heritability estimates for traits we're interested in are done after age 24, which is when heritability of mental traits tends to crystallize.
And what happens in those 20 years has an effect on the outcome. So if you take, say, for instance, two genetically identical twins and put one on a minimalistic starvation type diet for 20 years and the other one not, they're going to be different at the end. You know, genetics is only a bit player in this. And then you have things like culture. And yes, culture is a huge factor here. If you have a culture that doesn't believe in teaching you how to think, you're not going to get very far.
Okay, just with this word choice, I know that he doesn't know what he's talking about. Saying genes play a bit role is just him looking at the issue totally wrong. All organisms are genes expressed in an environment. An analogy I like to use is of a baked cake. So you have a cake. Is that cake a result of its ingredients, or is it the mixing and the baking? What percentage of the cake are the ingredients and what percent are the baking? Right, it's a meaningless question. The ingredients and the environment of the cake are enmeshed. You can't disentangle the two or say it's more one or the other. But what you can do is compare two cakes. You can say, what is the cause of a difference between these cakes? Different ingredients, but they're baked the same? Oh, then the differences between these cakes are a result of the ingredients. Same ingredients but baked differently? Oh, then it's the baking that is the cause of the difference between the two cakes. When we talk about heritability, we're talking about proportion of variance that is attributable to genetic differences. And that can be the aggregate of generalized variation within a whole population, or when comparing two different populations, like in the example of the cakes. The question, what percentage of the cow is genetic and what percentage is environmental, that is a meaningless question. All we can in principle make meaningful statements about is the cause of variance between cows. So when you say things like genes are a bit player, or what you said about the Amazonian person, you may think you're saying something that's kind of innocuous and kind of safe. You think that simply because you're so rock bottom stupid that you don't realize that you're actually saying literal nonsense, as in statements that don't even mean anything and aren't even truth apt. Like, I know the not even wrong theme is an overused meme, but when you talk about traits being genetic or not being genetic, or genes playing a bit part in the way you talk about it, the word choice that you use, you really are making statements that don't even rise to the level of being truth apt. It's what you're saying is akin to saying that cake is 50% a result of its ingredients and 50% of its baking. Right? It's a nonsense statement. The only thing we can make meaningful statements about is variance. Okay, so now that we know a little bit more what we're talking about, let's talk about this bit player thing Thunderf00t proclaims. Well, within the United States, the generally accepted number for the heritability of IQ, is IQ intelligence, I'll get to that. The accepted number for the heritability of IQ in the United States is generally agreed to be around 75%. I think it's around 80% because I found these studies systematically fail to correct for the reliability of IQ tests, but that's a minor thing. Now, I don't know exactly where Thunderf00t would want to go from here. He could deny twin studies. That's what Kraut did. And so we would be relitigating the whole find the genes except in front of an even larger audience. Or he could try to say that the race differences deviate from the general heritability number. And of course, the burden has to be on him in that instance, because otherwise you could literally always deny the application of a general rule to a specific instance. The argument that the black-white IQ gap is not necessarily 80% heritable because that 80% number is just a general rule. While that's true, the burden has to be on you because if it's not on you, you could just hand wave away any general knowledge by saying, oh, this is a specific instance. Yeah, generally IQ is 80% heritable, but we're talking about a specific instance, and in a specific instance, it could be anything, right? Do you see the problem with that? Do you see the hazard? Every instance is a specific instance, and if you allow people to just sort of hand wave away general rules to specific instances, then what's the point of having any general rules or knowing about anything? So this plants in different soil thing, yeah, this could be the case, or not. Also, when Thunderfoot talks about being raised in the Amazon jungle, by talking about this, he's revealing that he doesn't understand the parameters of the argument. No, the parameters are not very complex. When we talk about heritability estimates, we're talking about a specific range. The heritability of height is around 80% in the United States, but it's only around 60% in Africa. Talking in terms of a global percent genetic number, this is an error that stems from not knowing what heritability is and not knowing that heritability is about variation attributable to genetic differences within a specified environmental range. This is not pedantic. This is very important. If you don't know what's being talked about here, you're just going to go off the rails like Thunderfoot did. You're going to go off the rails and you're not even going to know that you're going off the rails. You're not even going to be aware that you're saying things that are literal nonsense. And Thunderfoot, you have no clue what the parameters even are. So you don't need to be saying that the parameters of this discussion are so complex or whatever. You have no clue.
You still have the thorny issue of, can you objectively measure intelligence at all?
Thunderfoot giving his ass opinions about intelligence is really obnoxious. This is a heavily studied topic. Your criticisms are noob pub trash. You don't know what you're talking about. And it's not that anyone really cares about IQ. Okay, that's one thing to understand. Nobody cares about IQ. What they care about is a general intelligence factor, or the G factor. In 1904, Charles Spearman formulated the idea about the general intelligence factor after noticing a correlation between subject grades in school children. Of course, that could just be down to diligence, parental involvement, whatever. All sorts of things could explain this correlation. But the correlation wasn't random. Spearman found that some classes predicted general performance better than others. This then led him to do research on IQ tests, finding that some kinds of tests predicted general performance better than others. And this was consistent. It was consistent among all individuals. For example, matrices, object assembly, and block rotation are better predictors of general performance than information or arithmetic. And so we say that matrices and object assembly are more G-loaded than information or arithmetic. This is also sort of why people who bring up the cultural bias argument against IQ tests, this is evidence that they don't know what they're talking about, because even if you do have a highly culturally biased subtest on an IQ test, how that's going to manifest is that that subtest is not going to be very G-loaded. Because if you're testing cultural knowledge, it's not going to be a good predictor for everything else, so it's not going to be very G-loaded. And since G is what we care about, not necessarily IQ, that whole a culturally biased subtest is going to make itself irrelevant by being so. Now, in the real world, IQ is apparently, and if you want to argue against this, feel free to, but it seems to me that IQ is the best general predictor for all outcomes in social science. Better than parental socioeconomic status, better than education level. For work performance, it's a better predictor than everything except a work sample test. It's a better predictor of someone's education level than their parental education level. It's a better predictor of their income than the income of their parents. It's a better predictor of criminality than the criminality of their parents. Not that IQ is the best predictor of everything, of every individual thing, but that it's the best predictor of all things taken together. It also correlates with perceived intelligence, and this relation increases over time. When you have a group of people, the first impression is that the most talkative people are the most intelligent. However, over time, perceived intelligence and IQ correlate more and more. Now, there are some limits to this correlation in that smart people tend to have smarter friends, and so a smart person might call someone with a 115 IQ average, while a dumb person might call someone with a 100 IQ smart. So the fact that the correlation between perceived intelligence and IQ seems to plateau at around 0.4 is perfectly respectable given the variability of subjective perception of intelligence. Now, on all this doxing stuff, it's interesting because before Thunderfoot made this video, I was convinced that he wasn't aware of the nature of the doxing server that he was in, but a few things he said in this video, now I'm convinced that he knew about it. First, this video telling us about his big alibi, oh, I was moving. Second is the really unlikely story that Discord crashed his computer. Normally, if someone said that Discord crashed their computer, I would go, that's really weird. I never heard of Discord crashing someone's computer. computer, but whatever, and I would leave it at that. But in this instance, it's like this really weird, convenient alibi. He's doing all of this despite there not being much of a call out against him, right? In fact, most people just assume that he was randomly added to the server like he's added to a whole bunch of servers. He's added to a bajillion servers and he just accepted the invite and whatever. But the problem is he tells us that this was the only server he was in on Discord. So the idea that he was just added to a bajillion servers and just clicked accept on a bunch of them, well, we now know that's not true. So what we know at this point is that he installed Discord specifically to get on this server. That's fact. That's what we know for sure. All this other stuff about him not really using it and not really being involved, like that's all just his story. That's all could be true, may not be true. But all we know for sure is that he specifically installed Discord to get on this server. Thunderf00t also tells us that he was squarely on Kraut&T's side in this kerfuffle, that he was on his side morally going into it, and he also defends Kraut's retarded arguments, and I suspect he suffers from the same kind of mechanistic autism that Kraut suffered from. And he's sort of low-key defending Kraut, saying that Kraut was too complex and sort of going over our heads, or heavily implying that. And lastly, he's talking out of two sides of his mouth here, because on the one hand, he's saying that it's not as bad as people are saying. He's trying to downplay the doxing server, saying it was kind of shady and scuzzy, but people are overblowing it. But then on the other side of his mouth saying he doesn't really know what's going on. Okay, so, you know, you need to pick one or the other, Phil. Now, for people who are hearing this and they're just wowing right now, look, you have no idea who Thunderf00t is. What you see on this screen here is a character. It's a persona he puts forth on the internet. It's all scripted, and your attachment to this character is tied up in an ideology and your own nostalgia. Also, in my opinion, the kind of tabloid, anti-feminism, anti-SJW creationism, right? He's on all the bandwagons. Not exactly a highbrow person, in my view, and so this doesn't really seem totally out of place with him. I mean, you could say, oh, he's got a PhD, but you know, people who sort of elevate PhDs to a really high status are people that don't know a lot of PhDs, in my experience. So, but you know, whatever. That's just what I think about all this.
Genetics are a real factor, no question. But the folks who tend to walk down this path seem to be heading towards the eugenics route, on almost as fleeky ground.
Nobody has talked about eugenics in this whole thing. You are the first to bring this up. You're bringing it up because it's a demon you have floating around in your mind. It's also dumb because humans are constantly evolving, and you can either direct that evolution by force or allow free breeding and see what happens. But either way, you're going to have some genetic change in some direction. Right now, in effect, high IQ people are being punished and made to subsidize the reproduction of low IQ people. And you can think whatever you want about that. I think it's a complex moral question that would take a long time to go into, but this just kind of hand-waving fear-mongering that they're going down the eugenics route, this is just dumb. As for on shaky grounds, Thunderf00t is so clueless about this general topic, he's like a guy who doesn't even know what the ground is.
And even if you can do all of that, say you can objectively prove that one race is smarter than another, so what? Newsflash, being smart is not what people look for in, say, for instance, leaders. It's not the best and the brightest. Otherwise, the US presidency wouldn't look like it does. People care more about if she's hot or if he can sing well or kick a ball or whatever celebrity. That rather than how smart they are.
Okay, well, I wrote an article and did a video on this that you might want to check out. It certainly wasn't a comprehensive analysis, but I basically came to the conclusion that you get more innovation in a country of 10 million white people than you will in a country of 10 million white people and 10 million black people. With Hispanics, broadly speaking, the effect isn't negative, it's zero. You'll get as much innovation with a country of 10 million white people as you will from a country of 10 million white people plus 10 million Hispanics. So I think the innovation that you get from Hispanics themselves just about offsets the depression of innovation whites get for just having to deal with Hispanics. And blacks, I think, are a net negative. You bring blacks into a white country, that country will innovate less in absolute terms due to the presence of blacks. And you can say that this analysis is really tenuous, and sure, you know, it's pretty thin. It's not a comprehensive thing. But Thunderf00t just comes in and says that having more people will increase innovation. And he has nothing behind this. He has zilch evidence behind that. So however limited my analysis is on this, it's better than what he has, which is literally nothing but faith and fear. Now, my mind exists in a world of predictive validity. Does the idea explain the world? Does it make correct predictions? If it doesn't make predictions, then it's not falsifiable. Does it predict? Does it work? Does it explain? And G, the thing that IQ tests measure, may be the longest lasting and most robust construct in all of psychology. I said on the Twitter, well, Thunderfoot is a chemist, and this may bias him to highly mechanistic explanations. And then he responds, sounds like someone doesn't understand that the brain works via biochemistry, electrochemistry. Well, it sounds like someone doesn't understand what science is, so I'll try to say to you what I said to Kraut. Say you have Bob and Bill. Bob has a highly detailed theory about growing corn. He's worked out all the particular mechanisms about how corn grows and has a theory about how to make corn grow better. Bill has a much simpler theory about growing corn. His ideas are much less complex, and in fact, Bill doesn't necessarily even disagree with what Bob is saying. He just operates at a much more abstract level. Now, Bill grows corn much better than Bob because Bill works with simpler correlations and doesn't see explanation of mechanism as the end-all be-all. He certainly has his own mechanistic theory, but that's not central to Bill in the way it's central to Bob. Now, would we say that Bob is being more scientific by demanding we operate at a lower level? Here's another thing to look at. In 2008, using SNP-based estimates from genome-wide association studies, researchers were only able to find a heritability of height of around 3% or 5%. In 2014, the narrow sense heritability estimates for guases were up to 60%. And that's nice, but the 80% number that we get from twin studies both predicts and retrodicts the heights of offspring better than 60%. So yes, they're finding genes for height, but it's still not as useful a number as the twin studies number. Now, Thunderfoot, please don't pull a crowd here. Please don't say, you're against molecular genetics and think twin studies are superior to molecular genetics. It's not that simple. I'm saying in this particular context they are. Now, when talking about intelligence, I have a proposed mechanism. It's the brain. That brain theirs that's doing the thinking. What? Is that not good enough for you? Why? A more detailed explanation is better? Why? Why is a more detailed explanation better? If a more detailed explanation doesn't predict any better than a simpler one, or predicts worse than a simpler one, then by what standard are you saying that a more complex mechanistic explanation is more scientific than the simpler one that predicts better? Because what it looks like to me is that you're more comfortable with a more complex mechanistic explanation because it sounds more like what you think of as quote-unquote science. But really you're just using sciencey sounding things as a binky instead of actually thinking in terms of predictive validity. Now, some listeners may hear me say this and be thinking, the gall, an autodidact lecturing a real scientist about what science really is. Well, you can just wow all you want about what I'm saying, but where's the lie? Thunderfoot was an open supporter of Kraut's arguments. His tweet betrays that he is not a scientific thinker, but a mechanistic thinker, that he confuses the identification of mechanism with science. But let's say you're a biochemist. You're not really making prediction models, and so the distinction between science and mechanism never pops out at you because in practice, that distinction never means anything. The distinction's academic. But if you're doing social science and you're doing things like population heritability estimates for psychological traits, that distinction between prediction and mechanism, that becomes very obvious and very meaningful. There's a huge gap between being able to make predictions and coming up with a mechanism for what's going on in the world. And that what I think is happening with a lot of STEM people is that they're not used to this gap. They're used to prediction and mechanism. They're used to science and mechanism being one and the same. And when you're in the social sciences, it's not the case. So they're not used to this gap. And add to the fact that I'm an autodidact, add to the fact that I have the most evil political views imaginable according to their pieties, they are more likely to imagine that I'm bullshitting them on this when I'm actually trying to explain to them the very basics of how this stuff works. And they're gonna find this humiliating, and they're gonna think that it's much more likely that I'm just another crank. Because if you just go with the odds, you go with their experience, it's true. It's much more likely that I'm just another crank than I'm actually right and they're wrong at a very fundamental level. But I think I've sort of made the case that they are wrong at a fundamental level and they don't know what they're doing when they get into fields where there's a distinction between science and mechanism, right? They're not used to that distinction existing, and so when they enter an arena where there is that distinction, they make all sorts of errors.